Welcome, 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 and thanks for listening. Tonight we're off to London with our favorite scholar and author of all things esoteric, Tobias Churton, or Toby on a good day. His new book, Celestial Realms, is a wonderful repository of the best celestial visions that have permeated humanity and in various cultures throughout history. For example, if you grew up in a Christian culture, these celestial visions might be called heaven, but they are by no means unique, and you'll see that they have been called different things throughout different times as people are transported to these different realms, and Tobias's work does a wonderful job unpacking them. And he should know because he's had his own experience with celestial visions, as you're going to hear and we're going to start off with right now.
Well, the summer of 1965 was auspicious for you, I think, because it was your first taste of heaven. But it was also important for me. But we'll get to that. Let's first get into the heaven
tell
first
the whole
in 1965.
story. Yeah, I was. What would I have been in that summer? I'd either been just 5 or just before 5, I think. And it was a holiday, summer holiday, and my mother was in the house. My father would have been at work. I was in the garden, pottering about, pondering things. I was on my own, and I just suddenly became. I was a 5. Well, it was me that was happening. I was suddenly aware of eternal dimension, and I started laughing, chuckling to myself that the notion of death was absurd, and I just knew, I don't know, Satori, I think, is when I read descriptions later of Satori as an overwhelming revelation from within that almost short circuits everything you thought you were, and suddenly click, you see. This happened, and from that moment on, I was slightly different in demeanor. My brothers would say, we're on the bus, and they'd say, Toby, do the smile, and I just had this almost beatific smile, which stayed with me for most of my life. It's been tarnished a bit in years gone by, because I don't know why. Well, state of the world, I suppose, but is a spiritual realization of immortality. The word immortality seems too technical to describe it. It is an amazing sense of timelessness and of real being. I, as it were, became aware of what I really am. I'd say now spiritually, but at that age, I don't know. I remember running into my mother, and I don't know what I said. I can't remember. She quietly registered it, and that was the first transcendental experience that I had, and it stayed. And of all the experiences I've had, that was the one that still has a kind of living pulse and colour. It was an amazing year, as I found out many, many, many years later, because 1965, I remember Aleister Crowley said that would be a remarkable year in the Aeon of the Child. Isn't that strange?
Wow. Yeah. Wow, that's interesting. So interesting.
It has the beauty that it was these were unlearned experiences. There's no precognition, and there was no suggestion. That was unless ye be as these children, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven, that sort of thing. But I wouldn't even have known that quotation or thought about it much at that time. The only acquaintance I'd had with death was 1963. My grandfather died, and I remember somebody showed me a book that he'd bought them. It was my brother. Showed me a book on locomotives, steam engines, steam locos. I forget the American phrase for steam locomotive, but it was a book of that. He was a train driver, my grandfather, and he'd written in it, and I became aware then at 3 that he'd really gone. That death seemed final. And I was moved by that and aware of death. So I was aware of death, and it clearly troubled me. But after this experience, the whole thing seemed absurd. Somebody once described death as a clown jumping through a hoop. There seemed to be a ridiculousness about our concern about it. That's how I felt it. That's how I remember it.
And has that stayed with you ever since that time?
Not with the absolute conviction. No, I'm having put my mind through a large amount of education, which is supposed to, by definition, bring out what is there. But I've certainly taken a lot in. I think my critical faculties are now so honed, and one becomes cynical about many things and uncertain about things that other people hold with great conviction. But it's still a rampart for me. There it is. I can never forget that happened, and I only wish I had that same consciousness every single day. I really do. I think there's no doubt in my mind that if we all had it, there'd be no need for gun control. I think people kill because they're frightened of death. This is the really bizarre thing, is that the very conditions of it's fear that is the problem in life. Fear is the key, isn't it? Was that a name of a film? It sounds like it, doesn't it? Fear is the key. It's also the source of much of our entertainment. So we're frightened. We're frightened people.
And so your thinking on that is that we watch films that scare us to constantly try to reassure ourselves that it's all not true.
Well, a lot of it's, yes, I think a lot of projection there is that we let our movies suffer for us, don't we?
Well, that's an interesting way to express it. Yeah.
And I think I have noticed that in the last few years, with all this new taste in for war, that my pleasure in a lot of films has decreased enormously. I can't stand violence in films now because there's too much of the reality around. I can't relate to the idea that it can be entertaining unless it's very sort of silly violence, or what I'd call comic strip violence. I think James Bond films, it's difficult to take the violence seriously in the old ones. Some of the new ones, they get, post Scorsese, you have it's more visceral. I can't stand that anymore because there's too much of the reality about. And I think films are about dreams and escapism and all of that.
It's so
as is a lot of religion, of course.
Yes.
Which is a kind of self-generated movie.
Yes. So interesting. I think that's very, very true. And sometimes it almost seems like the psychological state of some segments of our populations don't quite even catch the reality of the violence any longer. There is a defense against that, or a very primitive sort of self that doesn't really grasp the severity of it.
I think if it hasn't happened to a person or somebody very, very close to them, they're a bit like when we were children and we played various war games, and you sort of grab you imitated what you saw in the film, you grab your stomach and fall over. I mean, there was no reality in it at all. And blood is just ketchup. So I think if people haven't personally experienced these things, it's very easy to separate themselves from it. I think most people are pretty egocentric anyway, and they're full of defenses and barriers, and That's not happening to me. That's not me. That's somewhere else. That's to do with them. Or the classic one is, well, they deserve it, don't they? And all that sort of thing. Whatever consciousness happened to me at 5 doesn't happen to a lot of people all their lives. Even with experience, it doesn't get that far. Human beings, if you're a psychologist, or as they used to call it, alienist, you'll know that human beings are the problem. Whether with the solution is another matter.
It's interesting in your book that, and I hadn't done this before, but you're equating what you're describing as a Sartori experience as like this synonymous with heaven. And I guess I've always separated the two, but I think, am I correct that you're bringing them together?
Well, only because you can't define heaven as an object. It redefine the experience of the heavenly is redefined depending on the culture you're in, and depending on the perception of that culture about expectations of life, death, and reward, punishment, and all those things. So that you can't. It would seem to me that if you're talking about heaven as an ultimate place that is only fit for the divine, and that's how the first literary evidence we have for any ideas of heaven at all is about a place where gods live, not where human beings live. It's that heaven is up there because that's where the gods live. We can't get there. In the Mesopotamian religion, Assyria, Akkad, the Sumerians, heaven wasn't for human beings. Heaven was what rained down upon us. And if you didn't keep upstairs happy, you wouldn't get no rain or any other benefits. But man's job was to serve the gods. So from the very beginning, heaven has been associated with the highest level of experience, highest in older cultures, meaning the most powerful, rather than necessarily the most enlightened. You might have had more wisdom on earth than you had in heaven in many of the old cultures. So it wasn't necessarily a repository of wisdom, but it was highest in the sense that it had more power, more effect. And in that sense, Satori, which I would say is the highest kind of experience that can be remembered, we may have extraordinary experiences that we simply can't remember because they don't fit with the way the brain operates in terms of memory. I've often thought I've had things that I can't recall, And also the best experiences, spiritual experiences, are never reproducible in the memory at all. You can't conjure them up. You can only know you've had them. You may get a little flash, but you can't generate the spiritual experience from memory. That's one of the problems with spiritual experience. You may have the experience, but a week later, 2 days later, it's not going to be the same. We're slaves of time, and time takes us away from experience, as well as brings us towards it.
That's true, and I think even when people feel like they have some sort of recollection of these, for lack of a better term, higher states of awareness or consciousness, they're often at a loss as to how to describe them. The words simply aren't there. So even when there may be some vague memory, they're forced to sort of reconstruct it to try to explain it. So yes, I think that's true.
Yeah, and the thing about Satori is generally speaking, it's a kind of super intellectual experience. It's where the rational mind has been transcended, which is a very important state to achieve, I would say, because we rely too much on what ordinary reason. Ordinary reason needs to be enlightened. What is it? Dean Ing said, "Reason is the tool of the spirit." That sort of thing. It is not the arbiter of ultimate truth. it can only analyze what it knows. And that's why even in Freemasonry in the third degree, you have we have reached the reached the threshold of reason, but the experience is beyond that. So we've come to the throne of you've got to become a rational being, but reason is not it. That is not the answer. So when we try to bring heaven into rational terms, as you're suggesting, using our sense knowledge of physical space, color, smell, sight, hearing, these higher experiences simply don't conform to the ordinary analysis of the senses. And that for me is an excellent and good thing, and very much in the favor of heaven, I think, because in fact our physical sensations are very often very misleading. Indeed, actually. They're a kind of guide. I think Dean, he put it better than that. He said reason is a gift of the spirit. That's right, a gift of the spirit. So it's not. It's a positive thing, very much so, but it relies on something beyond it. And Plato had exactly the same idea with the guardian, which we might get onto later. The idea of later becomes the idea of the guardian angel. But the guardian in Plato is in the third eclogue and fourth tractate of Plotinus. He's talking about that you have an ordinary soul, or daimon, being, that is the personality. But there is also the guardian, and the guardian is in a way above. And the guardian has a relationship with our ordinary personality, but it cannot impose its will. The ordinary personality must make the choice to rise through the realms, through the, in Hebrew terms, you'd say through the heavens. It's up to the person, but the guardian is there to encourage and help. And if you're reincarnated, how your daimon in your next life will be dependent on the relationship you had with the guardian. The guardian can be completely ignored, but the guardian's job is to take you higher, to take you back to the intelligible world of course, Plato would say pure ideas, which we don't have. We don't have pure ideas in this world. We have, as it were, the memory of them. That's this memory thing again. The memory of them, and the education, if you remember in Plato, is reminding. It literally means to remember, to bring back to remembrance. So you're having to remember something that doesn't exist in memory. You have the same idea in the dance of the Sufi dance, the Dikra. The dance of the Sufi mystic is to remember again when one, as it were, danced in the heavens with the divine. So yes, I think Satori, heaven, they're just words for a higher world. But those are very enlightened ideas and very, you could say, cerebral ideas, really, of heaven. They require thinking about. Most conceptions of heaven are much cruder and simply based on the first part of the book. It says, "As below, so above." Most ideas of heaven are simply based on what people experience in this world, and then project into another world, and with some improvements that they'd like to see. So, I mean, you have in the Quran the idea of paradise. You have wine that never makes you drunk. I mean, wouldn't we all like that? You get all the pleasure from it, but you don't get the pain, right? So you get the intoxication in the pleasant sense, but you don't get the after effects. There's no hangover. So that's a condition of paradise now, and you can see that as a kind of sort of a bribe. It's a bit saying, well, not a bribe, but comparison. On earth, yes, you do have wine, but you have to pay this price. But if you bow down to Allah, then you get all the pleasure and none of the pain. So you're not going to choose hell once you're told that. I mean, that's It's a straightforward transaction. Do you want to go to hell, or do you want this wonderful experience?
I'm wondering if the ineffability of the experience you're talking about is in part based on the fact that it's not an intellectual or rational experience, but a literal experience, a literal transportation to a realm like you were talking about with Plato. And
I like the word transportation.
Yeah,
yeah.
And I'm wondering if that's why when we're there, we're literally in a different place, and then it's not just figuring it out. It's I don't know. Some of the in your book touches on that, but I'm just wondering if that's explicit in some of these other cultures.
Well, I think the idea of transport occurs in all the cultures at some point. Either it's simply going upwards on the basis that that heavens is in that way, but also you usually have a post-mortem journey, which is very often perilous, and you'll find that in Polynesian mythology, and you'll find it in practically every other mythology. There's a journey involved which is perilous and very difficult, that has to be undergone and still has risks, even though you're disembodied. There's still a risky journey to be made, and whether or not you end up in what some would call a hell or a blessed place, as the Isles of the Blessed, as you have in Greece, and something very similar in Egypt. Probably some interaction there. Depends on your conduct during the journey, and even in Platonic Gnostic ideas, you've got to make the grades. I mean, in First Enoch, which is dated, I suppose, comes to its full content around the 1st century BCE. There are 10 heavens, and they all have something to say or some sort of warning. In the Hermetic writings, you have 7 realms based on the planets and what they signify, and the sun and the moon. And then you get the Ogdoad, and then from the Ogdoad, or the 8th sphere, you start to hear the heavenly music. So there, yes, a transport. But I was thinking also of the metaphor we use about a transport of delight, of being removed from self. And I think that's the other thing you're talking about. When you're talking about removal, you're talking about removal from the ego consciousness, ego-centeredness. And that is to be in, as it were, another place. That, as it were, is important, because Jacob Boehme reminds us in his 40 Questions of the Soul that you don't go anywhere when you die. So he sets up this dialogue and says, well, where do you go when it's over? And he said, what do you mean go? He said, well, you've got to go to a place. He said, well, what do you mean go to a place? Where's this place? How could you go? He said, no, where you will be is dependent on where you are, i.e. spiritually. You're not, all that's going to be removed, it's really a kind of removal at death. It's not, you don't go anywhere. It's just that what you knew as sense experience, time and space, governed by those laws that govern time and space, they cease to be operative. And you are in the spiritual state you're in. And that's where, and what happens to you will depend on your ability to receive or experience the life of God, the higher life. I remember my old RE teacher used to say that for somebody who hated classical music, going to a Mahler concert would be pure hell. And this is really, and it's terribly true. They actually did an experiment a couple of years ago in England. They had a lot of trouble with young people gathering around cash machines outside supermarkets, and trying to break into them or just being a nuisance. And they piped classical music outside the supermarket, very at a volume that they couldn't avoid it, and they dispersed. Too much They couldn't bear. Of course, if they'd had hip hop music or something like gangster rap, I suppose there'd have been even more of them there. You know? But it, you know, heaven and hell depends on what you can cope with, what you are. So you have that idea in Jakob Boehme, which is an old Gnostic idea that basically, you know, God's wrath is simply the other side of God's love. And whether you experience God as love or wrath depends on where you are spiritually, what you are. So you make, in that sense, we write our own ticket.
I'm surprised no one has, and perhaps they have, I'm just not aware of it. But that would be a wonderful foundation for a film, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. Well, I think the whole subject, it begs for. There are so few films that deal truly imaginatively with the subject. They can't get away from this idea of a place and a time, and you can do all the silly special effects you like, but it's very difficult to visualize. I mean, they did make a film of Dante's Inferno in the 30s, didn't they? And you know, it was good special effects and wonderful sets, but there was no real sense that you were in any real danger or hell or anything. I mean, hell ultimately is like a nightmare where you have no defenses. The whole point about a nightmare is you've nothing to fight back with. It just hits you directly. So whatever's worrying you becomes overwhelming. And it's the overwhelmingness that creates the absolute fear.
Tobias, I'm going to try to let go of that thought before I go to bed tonight.
Think good thoughts.
I'm just curious. You know, this is such a central question. What took you so long to write this book, and why were you so keen on bringing it out now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I decided when I was about 24, and I had an insight into what Jesus meant, or as his exact words might have meant, very often paraphrased as the kingdom of heaven is within you. And I had a feeling that I had something really to say to that. And I thought, well, that's going to be my first book. And that's what I want to do. That's what I'd like to do. Because I had a feeling that if I could put it exactly as I was thinking it could sort of, naivety of youth, I thought it could change the world, to show the immanence rather than the ideal of heaven, but as something that is experienced and it makes sense and could be realized. And in fact, that didn't turn out to be my first book, but that idea has always been there in all the books. And then a couple of years ago, when I was thinking, the Putin invasion of Ukraine, the attack on civilians, the threats to the world, basically. He talked very lightly about nuclear war, and, you know, that he was quite prepared to go to those lengths to achieve what he thought he should achieve. It was so unnerving. And I had a friend who lives in Kiev, at the top of a block of flats, and he was every night experiencing these drones coming over Kiev, and he didn't know whether he'd be there the next morning, and this sort of thing. And I was having conversations with him like I'm having with you, but he's in Kiev, and and again, it was like a living nightmare. And I then thought, well, what with that and subsequent events, and then there was the COVID business and all this stuff, people experiencing a vulnerability to death. And I thought, well, maybe a book on heaven would be timely. I thought for those who have lost, those who might lose, or those, and we were all going to lose. And I've nearly all my friends have died as things have turned out.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and my family too. So yeah, there was some emotional reason to do the book, and I thought, well, I think that's probably shared, and it may not be universal because people don't want to think about these things, especially when they're frightened of them. But I thought I should make, and then it grew, and then I thought, well, it was originally going to be about Jesus and the kingdom of heaven, and anyway, my publisher would never have published a completely Christian text, Christian-oriented text. So I thought, well, we better do the lot then. And then I thought, well, nobody's actually done it before, which is to look at heaven in every single culture, in all periods, in all literatures. And on one hand, you might think, God, that's too much to do. But I found that it was possible to do it once you got started. Because sometimes you're dealing with non-literate cultures or where there's oral traditions, as in Polynesia, the pre-Columbian America. There's very little actual literal, so it wasn't so difficult there. Obviously, in European, Middle Eastern, Chinese, Japanese, you've got far more literature to think about, and but it became. Once I got going on it, it became quite systematic, and it seemed to be. It didn't tell itself. It was a lot of research and a lot of thinking going into it. But it was possible to do the whole thing. I wanted to call it Heaven the History. That was my title. But the publishers said there are too many books with the word heaven in the title. I thought, not in England there aren't, but in America, I think. America is a much more religious culture than, in terms of church going than England and Europe in general. So, I think a lot of people in my country would probably like to know what religion was. They've never heard of it. It is quite. The state education in England is virtually no attention given to religion at all. So if those people who later want to study psychology or philosophy, they haven't even got a grounding in development of ideas of the mind at all.
Yeah.
So they're learning things parrot fashion. They learn a bit of Freud, a bit of Jung, a bit of Adler maybe, and they think they've studied the subject. But I remember something Jung said, that all I've done is cast a small light into the very dark realm of ignorance, of enormous ignorance of the mind. He just thought he was starting something. He wasn't trying to set up a doctrine. But now you have Jungians following the gospel, but which he would have been, I'd say, at least uneasy about.
Yes.
A lot of his, that's another subject, in a way. Though I see all these subjects as absolutely bound up together. They're all about human experience on Earth and elsewhere.
And it's interesting how the different cultures have different descriptions of the heaven, for instance, and you touch upon that in the book.
Usually based on what was around them. In the African mythologies, pre-Christian, pre-Islamic Africa, everything in heaven reflects a mountain or trees or river or the animals, snakes and crocodiles and this sort of thing. I think everybody paints the next. Look at spiritualism, or as they call it, spiritism, as Allan Kardec called it. People who want to speak to their departed relatives regularly in seances. The idea of heaven there is almost like so familiar, so domestic, as to be you'd wonder why you bothered going from this world to the next. So that instinct to paint heaven in worldly colours is very deep in people, and you can understand it. I don't think people would be very frightened of the idea of that they have no idea what they're going to experience. Whereas for me, that's the adventure. I remember my old RE teacher, religious education teacher, when I was at school, used to regard death as the great adventure. I was very inspired by that. I've never longed for death at all. It frightens me because I associate it with loss and loss. And I happen to like what I found on Earth. I found so many good and beautiful things, I'll be very unhappy to let them go. But he would say it's the great adventure. I thought, all right, if that's what it is. Maybe it's completely unknown. What is it St. Paul says? We shall all be changed. That's a bit like voting for a party. You don't know what they're going to do. Starmer, our current Prime Minister, got into power by just saying, people want change and we're going to bring change. I thought, you don't need to bring change, mate. It's changing all the time. Everything changes. That's all that's ever going on. So you can be safe that if somebody promises change, this promise will come true. What he didn't say was whether this change would be a good thing for people. As it's turned, well, I think you can guess the rest. Yes, we've had change. Oh, gosh, yes, lots of it. But they won't get the vote next time, that's for sure. But yes, you can always, when people are worried, you just tell them it's going to change tomorrow, and that they'll grab onto that particular hope. I think heaven has been very much coloured by people's fears. So if you offer a nice picture, a comforting picture, obviously that's going to be the one that most people are going to try and grab onto. And but I think we have problems with it. It's difficult. There are big cultural differences. When I did an interview on Coast to Coast AM, a very, very large audience for this show across America. Nearly every phone-in person, it was amazing, was telling me that I needed to be saved, and that Jesus Christ had done this and that, and we didn't need to know any more than the Book of Revelation, the usual stuff, and the presenter would say, well, what do you say to that? And I'd say, well, yes, you're talking from inside a tradition, but you don't realize it. I said, I'm looking from outside at all these traditions. I'm not looking from inside. I have experience of the inside, but I've also got experience of the outside. And well, obviously, objectivity, as we call it, which is a phrase I don't like, a word I don't like, but the ability to see things from the outside is very rare in actual fact. Most people are married to their point of view. And if they see something, that's how it is. And that's all about survival. So I wanted to write a book that would calm all these different views, that gave equal space as much as I could to all the different thoughts, and that didn't impose, preach, or anything, just presented my analysis and reflection on what was believed. And there's no question that the most profound thought on this subject of heaven and the destiny of the soul, the most profound thought is in the Judeo-Christian tradition. There's no doubt of it. It doesn't require belief that the literature shows it. It's quite extraordinary, and also that most of that thinking had been done 2,000 years ago. We haven't really moved on in this field very much. I don't think.
Tobias, could you say something a little bit more? You said profound, that it represented a profound thinking. Could you say a little bit more about that, how you're thinking about the word profound?
Well, profound, just deep, just deeper thinking, based on a much more serious engagement with the questions of the validity of this life. The Jewish people were challenged so profoundly through their history, and seemed unusually, compared to other cultures, they seem to have been aware of it, or that there's always seems to be somebody in Jewish history who's got the antenna out, who's actually aware of what's going on and is trying to relate it to a much greater scheme, so that it is Yahweh. Yahweh is sending the Assyrians upon us because we've sinned. Yahweh is visiting us with plagues because the people have gone astray, or they're following the wrong paths, or whatever it is. And then there's this great belief that after Cyrus allowed the leading Jewish families back from Babylon to Jerusalem in 538 BCE, that a new wonderful era would happen. And this era didn't happen. And they were basically run by the Persians, and then later run by the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic Greeks, and then eventually for a brief time in the Maccabean period, they had their own king again, but the country was virtually in civil war for most of that time. And then the Romans turn up. So they'd had all these expectations that God cared about their destiny, and yet everything that happened to them seemed to be throw that hope away in real terms. And the reflections on that generate different kinds of reactions. Mysticism on the one hand, apocalypticism, which the Christian world has simply imported and still is reproducing the language which is relevant to the 2nd century BCE and is now applied to 2026 by people who can't understand the nature of historical literature. These people had to think very profoundly about what the individual could expect, what the nation could expect, and what God was really doing with them. So that's why profound. I mean, they experienced deeply, and therefore they thought deeply. Now, if you compare that with, say, Scandinavian and Teutonic culture, their idea of heaven is just a reflection of what they thought was good on earth. So any kind of heaven, only if you're a hero, you've got to qualify as a hero, mostly male, I think. You are entitled to endless feasting, endless mead, cider, beer. Life was just going to be like a party after the hunt. That is not a very profound view. But it kept the society going, because it said, well, if you're a hero and you help us invade that territory, you will get your reward. You will be able to have a period in the great feasting hall. Now, we can understand that idea of heaven, and it's probably some people's ideas of heaven, but it's not profound. It doesn't engage with the real existential issues of being an individual being in this world. Where you get more developed culture, you get more interest in the individual. That interest in the individual flourishes most of all in late Mesopotamia, 6th century BC onwards. From around 500-ish towards the Christian era, the Greeks start to think about the individual much more profoundly. The Jews certainly start to think about the individual more profoundly. You have the development of the Vedantist position and the Advaitist position in India. Hard to date that because we don't have the original manuscripts, but I think we're talking about the same period. You've got the Buddha, the enlightened one. He's thinking about, well, what's really happening to the individual. So you get this move to profundity, and you get these slightly different ideas of what the soul can expect after this life, or what you can experience in this life of another life that you may or may not have access to later. And I covered all of that in the book. And it was a pleasure to do it, because I think people have the most extraordinary ideas about, say, Hinduism. They get very confused between the different schools, not surprisingly, because there are so many different schools in India.
Yes.
Taking a popular figure, George Harrison, was very, very devoted to certain schools of Indian thought, but it's never laid out what these schools are and where they differ. And you can't imagine the Krishna people necessarily getting on with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi people and all of that. And then there'd be academics in India who'd look askance at any guru who went west with some sort of palliative Western anxieties. And so they don't understand the depth of that. So it's where you get the a real concern for the individual, you get the deepest thought on heaven. And that coalesces really around the 1st century, 2nd, 3rd century, late antiquity, and breeds extravagant hopes that God is about to intervene definitively and bring a new heaven and earth, and that the new earth will really be a kind of heaven, become a pure reflection of heaven, in fact. So you have that's the extravagant hope, which still is promulgated from the pulpits of the world. And then you get another reaction, which is a kind of profound pessimism, which you see in some Gnostic schools, which is that this world offers no hope. And the best thing is to flee it, as the Neoplatonists would say. And there must be a perfect world beyond that we will find a home in. So you have all these estimations of the value of the soul. Is the soul simply the feeling of being alive while we're alive? Or does the soul have an independent reality beyond the body? Or whether, in fact, the soul needs to be in some way transcended or taken. All these ideas. They're still with us. And over the years, I ask people gently sometimes, what their ideas are. And usually I could put practically everyone would go into one of these ideas that were around in late antiquity. So we human beings haven't changed much in the spiritual sense. I don't think we've changed at all, frankly. I don't think. It's very difficult. I think the concern of the individual, and where this concern of the individual is transcended by some sort of cult of the nation and things like this, which transcends the individual. So the individual becomes expendable in the pursuit of some greater power or some ideal that you're meant to believe in. I think we're going backwards then, because that's exactly how the early Mesopotamian situation of the Sumerians, the Akkadians, Assyrians, and later the Neo-Babylonian Empire and Persians took that view, that the individual's job is to serve the gods, i.e. the power. The king is the representative of God on earth, and our job is to service that relationship, the general population. Nowadays we have a democratic resistance to that belief, although we see the old thing coming back again. I think the great Moloch of state power, unstoppable, irresistible, all-knowing. These are worrying times.
Oh, so agree. So agree with you on that. Yes.
So I did think of a book that could offer truth, or a truthful assessment of these ideas. And when I delve in occasionally to the book again, because obviously writing it and getting it out, you read it too many times, you almost become numb with it. So it's always delightful if somebody else gets something out of the book and tells you about it, because you've forgotten what the original pleasure felt like when you were doing it. But when I have dipped in, it as a book, I think it's so full of nuggets that I would imagine at various times of my life and many others, oh gosh, I wish I'd read that then. That would have given me a little just a window. I
think it's interesting your description of the individual in relation to the state and how this is tied up in sort of the formulation of heaven. And I keep going back to this. Your call-in shows with Coast to Coast Radio, where people were calling in and talking about Jesus, and that's kind of like a personal relationship with the divine, not serving necessarily the higher power, and how that's, I think, related to your description of the holy guardian angel in the book too, almost, and Jesus being a different version of the holy guardian angel, but one I
think Jesus is the guardian angel of many Christian believers. I think he functions precisely as that. And their relationship, if they have a personal relationship or even a vision of Jesus as something intimate in their lives, they're really describing all the characteristics of the guardian angel. What's interesting is the Yezidis in Iraq today, their conception of Jesus is that he was an angel. When I first read that, I said, yes, of course. That's right. That's right. What a nice way to put it. I much prefer that to all the arguments about Son of God and stuff like this, which are historical epithets, which have a very strong relationship to Jewish history at that time, but were taken far too literally later. And the whole Trinitarian notion of, God in three parts, as it were, a bit like a TV series, Part 1, the Father. Part 2, the Son. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Part 3, the Holy Spirit. There will be no second series. And I'm being very facetious there, but I'm just trying to highlight a point that, in fact, we don't need to define God at all. I think it was Stanislas de Goethe, the French poet, who said, what did he say? Yes, a defined God is a finite God.
Mm.
Yes, we don't need to define. And who are we to define anyway? Yeah. Now, they were looking for definitions
theology
in late antiquity because of the institutional church was trying to weed out heresy or people who didn't toe the line of the bishops. So they had to, you've got to agree on this. And it was actually the whole thing of the creed came out of the emperors, not out of the church. It was the emperor, Constantine, to start with, in Nicaea, who says, look, if I'm going to make Christianity legal, what is this Christianity that I'm making legal? Can I have it in writing, please? We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, the only Son, blah, blah, blah. Great! Thanks. That's all I wanted. Now we can put it in law, and anyone who doesn't believe in these points is a heretic. Fine. Nullus hereticus. Terrific. Now we can move on. We've now got a state religion, and it's called Christianity. This is what it looks like, and this is what you've got to believe in. I mean, it was a legal thing. It was a legal thing. So definitions of God are for the benefit of lawyers, my dear Michael, but especially the lawyers of the state. And so it was, in fact, a form of control. I sometimes think of the Gnostic heretical period as a bit of a glorious period because there was so much freedom of imagination there. You could say too much in retrospect, but I think that occasionally the heretic has been very close to. I always said when I was younger, God is free. Don't compel him. Do not impose. Do not expect. Let him be, and let him in. And when I say him, I don't necessarily mean a masculine person. I mean, whatever we think is the most acceptable conception we can live with of this heavenly state, being, person. I think it is, but I think God, speaking as myself only, I'd say I think there is something personal about God, but we are people, and I don't see how we can relate to anything that is impersonal, really. We even make objects our own. Look at a child with his toy. To a child, a toy is a talisman. It's a communication between the world that he or she may be living in with their family and a world of pure imagination. And this object becomes that talisman, a magical thing. I do miss my toys. My father destroyed nearly all my toys in one of his fits of righteousness.
Oh, no.
And,
oh, my goodness.
Oh, yeah. Yes, he had a nervous breakdown. And I had to, how many times did I hear that quote from St. Paul? When I was a child, I thought like a child. Now I'm a man, and all that. And I don't think he understood what he was. Well, Paul did say some really dull things. And that was certainly one of them. But he was a Pharisee, as he constantly reminded people. And there was a certain woodenness. Women must have their heads covered in the synagogue. Why? Women must have their heads covered in the synagogue. It stands to reason. Whose reason? Who is this person? What is it? What is it he says at the beginning of Galatians? Anyone who with a message different to mine is accursed. Accursed. Now, a curse in the first century wasn't just like saying something rude about somebody. A curse was an invocation of a demonic attack. You would curse somebody, the word itself became a powerful thing. So it was not a word you used lightly. It was a form of magic, a curse. So he curses anyone who doesn't agree with him. Now, this isn't the St. Paul we've seen in Quo Vadis or what was the other one? The Robe, who's a sweet, sweet, wonderful actor. But I think the real Paul would have been quite terrifying. Personally, again, that's this is just my view after considerable amount of reading. But I'd say that there's always somebody who's read more, isn't there? But he's I call him Problem Paul. He's a difficult fellow. He's a mixed bag in there, and some of it's good, and you take what you can deal with. I personally think, well, my interest was always what Jesus thought. He's the one who interests me. I'm not interested in the apostles. The impression I get of them is they never quite got there.
Is it the depth of compassion too that influences that for you?
Well, only something divine could have the depth of compassion that people like to associate with Jesus.
Yes.
It would have to be divine, and these were not divine people. They were very well. We know. I mean, the story in the garden when they come to arrest Jesus, and one of them at least, I think one or two are armed, and they cut off the ear of the high priest servant, and Jesus says something quite extraordinary. He says, "Don't you realize I could get 20 or 40,000 angels if that's what I wanted? I don't need you. I don't need you." And he heals the broken ear. It's I always thought there's more to Jesus than the Gospels. I mean, it's only right that there should be more to this character than, if that's the right word, this being than meets the eye. I think we only get a little glimpse in the Gospels through the eyes of human beings. Were those eyes capable of seeing his real nature? It's very, very, I'd say that not really. No, not really.
I'd agree.
What is it? Jesus was promised in the church. Salvation was promised and the church came, or something like that. There is a letdown. I think he should never have left. You see, he should never have given himself up. He should have hung around for a few thousand years and straighten the world out. But it just shows you with the best God's will in the world. He had 12 followers, and he didn't manage to straighten them out completely, to say the least. We don't know what happened to most of them. Human beings are very difficult material to work with, and if I was their creator, I'd wonder what the hell I'd created, But this is all very anthropomorphic ways of thinking about God. God is the problem of our existence, and our existence is the problem of God. Mm-hmm. And I'm more and more drawn to the notion that we are involved in a terrible mystery. I don't say that as a resignation, just that as a corrective to thinking we're anywhere near got it. And I think that when I did the Heaven book, I thought at the end, Well, Tobes, have you learnt anything new from this book? Really, by this very, very deep engagement with these questions in many different cultures. Have you, Toby, learned anything more? One thing, how to get it over to other people. I learned something about that. That sometimes you don't have to state it directly. You can point towards things and people will find their own way. So in that sense, I was learning, it was how to communicate all these ideas of heaven for very different people. Yeah. Not everybody has much education and so forth. Though obviously my books are going to appeal to people who are educated. I mean, they're not at the beginner's level. I'll be honest about that. But nor are they meant to be remotely academically specialized at all. I try to talk in good plain language. People say, he presumes too much knowledge. Well, that's a really dodgy one today, because how much knowledge can you presume that anybody has? I mean, I spoke to a chap the other day. He's done his, he's graduated from school, and he didn't know what the word ordination meant, to be an ordained priest. He said, what does ordained mean? Mm-hmm. Well, it's the way people become priests. What's a priest, really? It's very difficult. Somebody told me, I was talking to a lady in Maryland the other day, and she said that she was involved in teaching. Said their children had almost no teaching on poetry. There was no poetry being taught. Yes. And there was a law of George Bush or something that every child had to leave school with some sense of a qualification, or they couldn't be allowed to think that they'd failed in school. So it was really, the teachers were encouraged to, even if the child didn't attend, that they had to tick the box that they had attended, and this sort of thing for the benefit. Education today, goodness. Luckily, I didn't have that problem so much, because my father always said to me, he had his good moments, he said, Toby, it's not what you do at school that matters, it's what you do at home. And that's been my life. Even though I've been through the educational process, Oxford University, all of that, nearly everything that I've really learned, I learned in my own time and at my own expense. And I buy my own books, and I've never had a grant to study things. I get, was it Baden-Powell, paddle your own canoe? So, wherever that brings you.
Or follow your heart.
Is bringing you.
Yeah.
Yes, certainly follow your heart, certainly. And in order to do that, you mustn't lose contact with it.
Yes.
I think this is one of the troubles as people get older, and it's the heart is the first casualty. You could say heart disease, maybe due to heart disease.
What do you attribute John Lennon's line toward the end of your book about imagine there's no heaven? Is that a heart disease, or is that a reaction to something?
I think he was just I think he was going through a period where he was trying to impress some left-wingers in England who'd taken the mick out of some of his events, like the bag event in late 68 and then 69. They said, all this posing with Yoko Ono in bags. She had this idea that if people wore bags, then there'd be total communication without prejudice. If you couldn't judge what the person looked like, you wouldn't be prejudiced against them. So perhaps when people met, she was suggesting there'd be meet better in bags, which is a nice artistic idea. And so they took to doing events in a bag. And I remember one particular political figure in England got up and said, "Do you care, John Lennon? Do you care?" Meaning all this arty stuff but there are things happening in the world, that people are taking positions on. Should there be a revolution? Should that revolution involve violence? Should we just be wave flowers and all this sort of thing? So I think he was trying to impress Tariq Ali and some of the other left-wingers in this country, and then later Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman in the United States. And I think he got alienated from his heart, the heart of his creativity for a period, but he was, I think that was due to personally think it had a lot to do with the breakup of his relationship with Paul McCartney and the problems of the Beatles and the management and all the, I wasn't there. His perspective on that would have been so different to any of us would know. But I think when it comes down to it, he was trying to also bring Yoko's ideas in. She'd done a book where there's a lot of statements, imagine this, imagine that, imagine the clouds dripping, dig a hole in your garden to put them in, which is, again, a nice artistic idea. It's sort of shades of Marcel Duchamp. Imagine show the elephant's tail, you can imagine the elephant, so there's no need to draw the elephant, just stimulate the imagination so that the viewer of the art becomes a co-creator in the art. Again, a nice idea. I think, and in some ways it's a fundamental one, and you could say, well, actually that's what happens with every work of art. It always suggests, a good work of art always suggests more than you see anyway, I think, to most perceptive people. You could say this is a bit of an excuse for doing very simple things, but she had the Zen minimalist thing going as well. The koan, say it in a line. Okay. Lennon always liked that, if you can say it in a line, because he loved in advertising how you could conjure up a reaction from people with just a line. And he was always, how do we use that in songwriting? Now, getting to the point, the line appears in the song, imagine there's no heaven. It isn't hard to do. Well, I'd say absolutely. It isn't. What's much more difficult nowadays is to imagine there is a heaven. That really requires some imagination, and always did. And but that line comes with all these other things. Imagine no possessions, imagine those countries, imagine this, and imagine. It's pure. I mean, it's pure utopianism. I mean, it's you can imagine it, but you can't imagine how it could ever. These factors could ever become real. But the Yoko optimism is, well, but the first step to making these ideals real is to imagine them. Well, I personally wouldn't want to imagine a world where there was no possessions, for example. I only look at the garden and see how the birds fight over property and over their food. And where there's no law, there's anarchy. And the existence of possessions draws a line around things that thus further you shall not walk. And the moment you remove those lines, you don't end up with a paradisal, Edenic sharing. You end up with villainy and the Wild West. That's my reading of it. So if you want a peaceful new world, I think you've got to have somebody to actively make that peaceful world possible. And we know what that really means. You've got to have law, and you've got to have instruments of the law, because there are some people who otherwise don't respect the law. When I was young, I certainly didn't, and I was pretty anarchic as a youth, not in a harmful way, I hope, but I was pretty much indifferent to other people's wishes. I didn't mind upsetting the odd person, because my viewpoint was egocentric and selfish fundamentally. I was thrusting out. I wanted things, and so I think the idea that he was responding, I think, to the socialist notion that if you took away all these alleged evils and merged everybody into a communism, a community of interest, then my interest is my brother's and sister's interest, and we can work all this out together and we can share it. And well, we know what happens when people try to do this. There's always somebody whose needs anyway, who really needs more. Cut your cloth according to the man. Some people definitely can do with more than other people. There's no equality in nature. It just doesn't exist. The only nearest thing we get to equality is with machine tools, where we can say this is precisely 12 inches long, and this bit, and every single one will be exactly 12 inches long. If you're able to cut reality by will, you can have as much equality as you like. But nature has no interest in the notion of equality. It simply isn't there. You can say, well, you should be treated equally. Well, yes, as it's sort of in the sense of equity, in the old common law sense in England, English common law, there should be equity. There should be a sense of fairness. Yes, absolutely. But equality, you'll never get it. Things change constantly all the time, and this cannot be a perfect world. Cannot be. Which really brings us back to heaven, which is our repository of our dream of a perfect world, I think, today. I think that's what probably heaven means to most people today, is the notion that there is a perfected world. Now, you can draw on that idea of perfection, and through small things, we can ameliorate, which means to put honey on. We can put honey on some of the horrible things that we're involved with. So I think there is a real practical idea of heaven, which is that we can draw on these ideas to improve things here, and then you live. That is a more spiritual way of looking at it. That we are already half in one world, half in another, so long as we're here, and that sort of idea would make heaven more real to people, rather than a kind of a prize for having lived at all. Yeah. Oh, don't worry. I know you're dying, but you're going to a better place. Well, why didn't I go there before? Why come here at all then? If there was a better place all the time, all those sort of questions. Yeah, I think John in later years probably felt the lyrics of Imagine were a bit like a weight on his back. I suspect nobody would want to publicly repudiate a song that was popular, and John least of all. But the impression I got from his last interviews was, I think he said at one point something like, don't think I go around walking the streets thinking, imagine there's no heaven all the time. It was a viewpoint at the time. I think he was trying to make a political song with an excessively popular lyrical base. I mean, the music and the recording of that song is beautiful, it's haunting. The sound of his voice is, I personally think, is very lovely.
Yes.
The piano is extremely well recorded with the use of bass and very subtle drums and all that. So, as a piece of pop music, it's great. But he was actually trying to make a case for a socialist paradise. And I know that in his last years, but he didn't know they were last years, so his viewpoint may have changed again. He was saying that I realize now it's not so much possessions that cause the problem, it's possessions of the mind. It's ideas we hold that we will not let those ideas adapt or let them change, or when we see something, a better viewpoint, a larger viewpoint, we're not prepared to abandon those ideas. We attach ourselves to them. This is what I believe becomes where the ego invests itself. Was it Nietzsche said, strong ideas are prison houses of the mind? I believe. See, immediately aggressive. The fist goes in the air. I believe. Ego, right, okay, got you. So why do you need this belief? They're just trying to rouse a rabble. That's all. But so I think the practical value of heaven is to give us inspiration of a bigger viewpoint, a larger point of view. And while I'm very much for the individual and individuation, the becoming an individual, I don't think we're necessarily born individuated. No. It could be a lifetime's process, or perhaps several lifetimes process, if you believe in that idea. But I think that we need a repository of our best, but it's no good if we just stack our stuff in there like an attic.
Right.
We must be drawing upon this all the time.
Right.
So we should have heavenly thoughts, and we should have heavenly ideals, and we should be reflecting all the time that we are not at our best, and we can do better.
Yeah.
Well, this book's definitely a repository of our best. I mean, what a summary. I mean, it's just like you've taken the best from all the cultures of all time and done it.
If only they had as well.
Well, but at least, yeah. I mean, but
we got to start somewhere.
This is a repository of the best. I love that as a description of the book. You can put that in my review of the book. It's a repository of our best.
That's what you should call your podcast. That really.
Yeah. I need to change my name on my podcast. I think you need to help me with that. But now that Lynn's along for the ride. So, well, I know one thing about you that's also true is that you're probably up to some other mischief. You probably have some other book project. I was wondering, like, how do you top this? But you probably, I don't know.
I don't know. I love talking about what I'm doing now. It's much easier than talking about what I've done already. I only feel really alive when I'm doing these things. It's quite difficult actually to talk about my past. Well, I'd rather be the listener and hear what people think of it.
Yeah.
And reflect on how it's been received. I don't really like talking about old work. Not that it's old in that sense, but to me, the whole process of producing a book, by the end of it, it's like, give me a few years before very often I wouldn't touch a book for about 3 or 4 years, and then I'd read it, and sometimes I'd be surprised that, much better than I remember. But I have got a wonderful book on at the moment. It's something. When I first went to Oxford, I thought Oxford University, great name, famous, and all this, and members of my family had been there in the 18th century, and I felt I was bringing the name back. And they were all involved with the church and leading theologians at the time. And I wanted to, that tradition had died out. I wanted to bring it back. But I thought it'd be a great place to do fresh research, new things. I'd done the O-levels and A-levels, as they called it in England, which is quite a high a level already if you've done what were then called advanced levels. And I didn't think I'd just be presented with a list of things I've got to do and attend those lectures, and you've got to read those books and write those essays, which everybody else on the course is doing. I wanted to do some original research. So I went to my supervising tutor and I said, well, I want to do something original. And he said, well, that's not really what you're here for. We want you to reach a standard that we can judge it. I said, well, that's not very exciting.
I love that.
He said, there is one thing. He said, if you do a dissertation, you can drop one of the other papers. I think there were about 10 papers or something, which were separate subjects, like ancient Near Eastern texts, New Testament Greek, the prophets, 19th century religious philosophy. All those are different papers. He said you could drop one of the papers and do a dissertation of 10,000 words and on a subject of your choosing if it's approved. I said, great. I want to do magic and the Old Testament. There was a pause. I shall have to take some consultation, see if there's anybody who could mark it. I'll be in touch. So I was eventually called back a week or two later, and he said, well, I'm afraid you can't do it. I said, well, why not? He said, there's nobody who will mark it. Apparently nobody's looked at this subject to sufficient level since the 1890s, to which I said, well, isn't that a very good reason to do it? He said, well, you might do it, but nobody would be able to, there'd be no standard of reference to contemporary intellectual scholars, etc., that we could be judged by, so I'm afraid you can't do it. I said, well, this is supposed to be the great university. He said, well, perhaps you could take an interest in this at postgraduate level or something like this. But he was really delighted because the very word magic gave him the heebie-jeebies. he was a really odd combination. He was an evangelical Catholic, which is frightening thing, you know. It's, anyhow, yes, he became a bishop. Poor, I feel sorry, greatly pity his flock. But anyway, that's another. So I couldn't do it, and that idea was always lying around, like the heaven idea. It was one. I mean, I sort of forgot about it. I don't know why I wanted to do magic when I was just 18 when I went to Oxford. Why did I want to do magic, and why had I paired it up with the Old Testament? Because there really isn't. I thought there isn't no much obvious magic in the Old Testament. Anyway, I finished the Heaven book, and I had wanted to do a book about the abuse of religion in politics, but the publisher said, we don't want to do political books. I tried to get it with a Swedish publisher, and they found it too frightening because I was going into some of the sources that some of our political leaders, including Putin, have been reading over the years, which are quite scary if you actually read where they're getting their inspiration from. They never write about it in the newspapers. You had some serious research had to be done. Luckily, I had a friend who studied Russian literature, and it was very interesting. Anyway, I thought it was a timely book. I think people would like to know why they want to do these terrible things. But anyway, I couldn't get a publisher. Nobody would touch that. So it was a bit like my dissertation, aged 18. Here we are. I'm now 60. What year is this? I'm 65. I still can't get my dissertation published. But anyway, I thought, well, that's it. There's nothing else I want to do. I've touched heaven. What more can you ask? You know, angel came down from heaven yesterday, stayed long enough just to rescue me. I thought, well, maybe it's time to leave it. And at that, almost at that moment, into this void came this old idea. Well, magic in the Old Testament. I now know enough to realize how difficult it would have been to have done that when I was 18. At the time, I thought, God, I said, no, you can't just do the Old Testament now. It's like the heaven, but you can't just do the Christian viewpoint. You've got to look at something. You've got to look at a bigger canvas but one that's containable. So I thought, magic and the Bible, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Tanakh, and the Christian scripture. So let's look at magic in the Tanakh. Let's look at the Christian scripture. And no one's done this as a whole before. And I suddenly realized this hasn't been done. I wanted to do it a long time ago, but now I can do it. I felt, well, I started on that, and it's been an absolute mind opener to take that oblique cut through the scripture, to be looking in terms of the relationship of the very, very many different parts of the scriptures, and see their relationship to magic. It's been one of the best trips I can remember. It really has proved to be, and I can't tell you why. You'll have to ask me when it comes out, next year or perhaps the year after. I don't know. They haven't given me a schedule for the publication yet, for the actual release. But I think it's really, again, it was so. I probably wouldn't have done as good a job if I hadn't done the Heaven book anyway, because you've got magical ideas involved in the Heaven with the Holy Guardian Angel and this sort of thing. So that's what I've been engaged with, magic and the Bible, and I look forward to seeing it.
Yes.
Well, Tobias, thank you so much for sharing your new book and the wonderful celestial visions and experiences and communications that have permeated human cultures throughout history. And by all means, if you're ever here in Illinois, look us up. Lynn and I'd be glad to take you around to all the Lincoln sites if you ever want to leave the mothership. And have a great weekend.